Defining and measuring poverty. Before getting started, here is a brief overview of the topics we'll be discussing in this video. Firstly, poverty is a complicated and controversial issue within the U.S. and around the world. Different nations use different ways to measure poverty. In the U.S., we currently use the official poverty measure, or OPM, which is shown on the graph in comparison to another scale, the supplemental poverty measure, or SPM, which we'll delve more into later. This measure has been both praised and criticized, causing many people to question both the measurement and definition of poverty in the U.S. In this video, we will go through how others define and measure poverty in order to build our own definition and measurement of poverty. When thinking of poverty, the image of not having enough or lacking something comes to mind. We will discuss what exactly poverty is a lack of, referencing three authors, Iceland, Orshansky, and Rector. Secondly, we will discuss the concepts, capabilities, and functionings to discuss what else may define poverty. To finally come to our definition.
Like so many people around the world, John Iceland defines poverty as income deprivation. He implies that poverty is dependent upon the level of income of an individual. But should money be the only measure? The various ways of gauging poverty are discussed in his book, Poverty in America. The official poverty measure, the OPM, which was created by Orshansky based on the economy footprint, takes a third of the cost of food and multiplies it by 3. With this formula, a threshold is created above which a family or individual is considered not poor and below which they are considered poor. The threshold created by Orshansky is absolute, meaning it is unaffected by the changes in people's living standards. Additionally, it is not based on where a person may live and how that may affect their cost of living. Other non-discretionary expenses like water, electricity, and medical care are not taken into account by the OPM. Therefore, that is a limitation because it excludes a segment of poor individuals. The OPM's limitations were considered when the supplemental poverty measure, the SPM, was created. He considers the numerous government initiatives created to help low-income individuals and families but were previously excluded from the OPM. The SPM adds cash income to the refundable tax credits under non-cash benefits and subtracts the non-discretionary expenses plus the taxes. In this chart, we see a comparison of poverty measure concepts of the official and the supplemental methods. Although the SPM is a more effective version of the prior indicator, the OPM, it is still a method of measurement based only on the income of the population. But is that all? Should that be the measure of poverty? Should the amount of income, whether cash or non-cash, or the spending habits be the only measure of poverty? What about the people who are financially secure yet unable to make use of it? Consider a person with a disability who is financially secure but unable to use their resources to access their necessities because of their handicap. Do they not lack means? Or the individuals who are in possession of resources but unable to access them because of political constraints or inequalities, are they not poor? Or the people that are right above the income threshold but are eating one meal a day and spending 80% of what they earn on medical bills and other utilities, are they not poor because they're just above the income threshold? The previous method of measuring poverty should make us think again. Is money the only measure for poverty? Or are there other attempts to measure poverty that cover every need for a person to have equality?
Rector's definition of poverty is an inability to provide yourself and your family with reasonable shelter, nutritious food, and clothing. In his article with Sheffield, Rector talks about the different living conditions of those in poverty, and goes on to talk about the results of REX, in which he took the amenities a household has and made comparisons between them. When finally, in his analysis, he determined that out of the 37 million of Americans that are supposedly struggling with poverty, only a small percentage of them are actually in poverty because of the amenities they have and the standard of living they have in comparison to Europe and other much more impoverished people. In his article, Rector made a good point when he highlighted the idea that over-exaggeration of the actual living conditions and the cause of deprivation can be very misleading to the public and will benefit no one as a whole. We agree with this aspect of Rector's ideas because even within our definition and measurement, we want to be able to get the exact data. Rector also makes a good point that anti-poverty policy should be based on an accurate assessment of actual living conditions and causes of deprivation, which we as a group are taking into account in our measurement of poverty. We respectfully disagree with Rector's view on poverty. We disagree with him because we believe that basic materialistic objects should not be a sign of whether a person is in poverty, and we should take into consideration the inclusion of quality of life in the measurement of poverty. Rector makes the argument that the majority of people in America who are supposedly in poverty have air conditioning, a refrigerator, a microwave, and so forth. He argues that because these people have these objects, that means that they are not in poverty because those are not basic necessities, but rather comforts, amenities, or wants. Based on our definition of poverty, we do not agree with the way in which Rector makes it seem as though having certain wants or amenities makes someone more or less impoverished. We are open to the idea that most of these amenities that people have are part of the things they need in order to have the quality of life they deserve or are striving for. We also believe that we should also take into consideration that there are different circumstances in each household as to how they came about with these amenities and also how they are able to afford them as well as why they should have them. Capabilities are an approach that takes into consideration each person as an end and the opportunities available to each. Nussbaum believes that we shouldn't just generalize from what the group says, but rather see what each person wants and finds necessary for quality of life. This approach is concerned with both social injustice and inequality, especially when a capability can be fulfilled due to discrimination. It mostly focuses on the freedom to choose. Capabilities define poverty as the deprivation of multiple freedoms people value and have the right to value. Basic capabilities are the existing faculties of a person that makes their later development and training possible, meaning that capabilities are the basis that a person uses in order to be able to grow. The approach of capabilities insists on the political goal that all should get above a certain threshold level of combined capability, in the sense not of coerced functioning, but of substantial freedom to choose and act. Some advantages of capabilities are that it takes into consideration the actual ability of a person to achieve the various functionings as part of their living. It's a person's actual freedom to live in both the social and necessities aspect. And it has to do a lot with personal evaluation. Acceptable levels can vary and most might not even have the income to reach adequate levels. Another disadvantage of capability is that some of its factors, although necessary, can't truly determine whether someone is above or below the poverty line in real life. Someone might argue that other species or even play aren't truly necessary in order to be able to measure someone's poverty. Even though our definition of poverty is profoundly based on the 4 basic necessities, we would also like to highlight that quality of life should be taken into consideration just like we do in our definition. Having other species and even play are both capabilities that help a person increase their happiness and determination. And although they are not as important as the others, these capabilities are an example of things that give a person the ability to have freedom of choice.
We still ask ourselves, how should we measure poverty? In 1990, the UNDP developed the HDI, Human Development Index, to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not only the economic growth. In 2010, the UNDP introduced a Multidimensional Poverty Index from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI. The MPI shares with the HDI in terms of dimensions, but goes further by incorporating more indicators. There are 6 indicators for income, namely electricity, sanitation, water, house flooring, fuel for cooking, and assets. 2 for education, mainly years of schooling and child attendance at school. Lastly, there are 2 indicators of health, namely child mortality and nutrition. There is an overall weight of a third for each dimension, but given the composition of the dimensions, there is an effect, a relative weight of a sixth for each item in education and in health, and a relative weight of 1/18 for each item in income. The MPI is calculated using a threshold count approach. That is, an individual is deemed poor if the number of deprivations total to at least a third of the weight items. In a way, the MPI sets a minimum condition as necessary to be able to pursue a life that is worth living. To calculate the MPI, we get the product of the incidence and the intensity. The incidence of poverty is denoted by H and the intensity is denoted by A. So the incidence of poverty is the proportion of people identified as poor on the basis of the multiple deprivations they experience, and H denotes the headcount ratio. The intensity of poverty is denoted by A, and it is the intensity or how poor people are, and it is the average proportion weighted deprivations poor people experience, and it denotes the average deprivation share. So here's an example to understand the incidence and intensity of poverty. Imagine 2 countries. In both, 60% of people are poor. This 60% is the incidence of poverty in both of the countries. Based on this incidence, the 2 countries are equally poor. Now, imagine that in one of the 2 countries, poor people are deprived, on average, in 1/3 of the dimensions, whereas in the other country, the poor are deprived on average in 2/3 of the dimensions. By combining the 2 pieces of information, the intensity of deprivations and the proportion of the poor people, we can see that these 2 countries are not equally poor. Moreover, the second country is poorer than the first because the intensity of poverty is higher among the poor. So our definition of measuring poverty takes into account the MPI and the capabilities approach, which we agree should be a measure of poverty in regards to having a quality life.
Going off of capabilities, this brings us back to needs, both physical and more abstract ideas, many covered by the concepts on Nussbaum's list of capabilities. Issues we have mentioned with other definitions of poverty is that many strictly focus on physical needs, such as the absolute poverty measure or the OPM. This makes basic needs necessary and sufficient conditions, meaning if you have your basic needs met, you are not poor. If you do not have them met, you are. This makes poverty appear as one-dimensional monolith of an experience, illustrating that those in extreme poverty are the only ones actually in poverty. This is how more abstract concepts become a concrete part of poverty. Being restricted from certain capabilities that do not fall under the necessity and sufficient umbrella can instill and indicate poverty. For example, looking at a communal level, a lack of the capability, senses, imagination, and thought can be seen through the education system within the community, or another capability, such as bodily health, can be viewed by observing the access to healthcare or life expectancy in an area. This lack of capability goes hand in hand with the concept of social exclusion. Social exclusion is being prevented from participating socially, culturally, economically, and politically in society due to economic or other social standings. Social exclusion is a result of poverty, as impoverished communities and individuals cannot be involved in aspects of society. With capabilities, needs, and social exclusion comes functioning. Functioning is the actual beings or doings. So functioning is the act of eating food, while capability is the ability to have access to that food. In order to form a functioning, you then have the capability or opportunity and choice to be or do this action. Therefore, functioning is not the key to defining poverty. If we only look at people's functionings, we are overlooking if they have the choice to do or not do this functioning. For example, food is a necessity for life. So when we think of poverty, we often think of access to food. If we were to take two individuals who both did not eat one day, and then stated that they both must be poor, we assume that they did not have the choice to eat or not eat that day. However, one individual is financially stable, has a good life, but is simply religious, and fasting for this reason, while the other cannot afford food at the time, making the second person the only one to be in poverty. This is why, when defining and measuring poverty, we need to take both capabilities and functions into account, but mainly focus on capabilities. Now with this, why should we care about people's choices and actions? This brings us to the concept of quality of life. When discussing capabilities and functionings within poverty, we are thinking of an ideal livable and not just survivable life, creating this other branch of poverty, which is not just material deprivation. This idea can be captured in the concept of quality of life. This is looking at people as more than just their income or numbers, instead concentrating on how they live their lives. This argues against a more modest threshold by bringing up that just because you make a certain amount of money and have the basic necessities, that you are doing quote-unquote okay. Finally, taking all of these factors into account, we define poverty as a state of living with the absence of accessible resources while also experiencing exclusion from society. We believe that poverty must include income deprivation, as well as social aspects such as social exclusion and lack of capabilities. Accessible resources represents both physical necessities and capabilities. We also mention social exclusion as it prevents those in poverty from having a high quality of life, as well as continually restricting their capabilities. In summary, poverty is not just a lack of the basic necessities, food, shelter, clothes, and utilities, but also the ability to pursue or possess a higher quality of life. Our idea on how to measure this is the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which considers mobility not necessarily just poverty, which factors in capabilities such as education,